Hello everyone, this is Albert, and I wanted to point out a series of articles that were published a few months ago on a blog called The Internet Monk by Michael Spencer. Excellent blog, by the way. And these articles have gotten a lot of attention. They've actually been published in edited forms by a few newspaper syndicates, but I wanted to point you to the originals in their full form because I think these articles are really, really important. Spencer, who himself is, he runs the Internet Monk blog. That's his blog. He also, I believe, is one of the people in charge of the Boar's Head Tavern blog. He essentially is predicting the collapse of American evangelicalism. That it's basically it's going down and going down hard, and he gives reasons for it, including it's basically sold itself out to consumerism, to the Republican Party, to various other things that have nothing to do with Christianity. And it's failed to pass on the Christian faith in any defensible form that can withstand this secularist ideas. That it's the bubble that it's constructed for itself, particularly in the Bible Belt, is being challenged as people move around the country, and the ties to this evangelical subculture weaken, and as those who supported the evangelical movement in terms of the parachurch ministries financially are dying, because they're primarily the World War II generation, and the baby boomers that follow are a lot more discriminating in terms of whom they support. So he thinks it's essentially you're going to see a lot of the major ministries, a lot of the big churches just completely collapse at some point. A lot will survive, but in a much more reduced form, and it spirals because, of course, if you can't afford the airtime, then you don't get as many donations because people don't hear your message, etc. So, and then with the financial downturn, of course, that's not going to help either. He does an excellent job with the articles. I wanted to point out one thing, though, that I think he didn't latch onto, that I think is really behind a lot of it, and what I think he didn't point to is that what you're seeing with happening with evangelicalism has happened before. This is in fact what happens when the church ties itself to the culture. This is the net result, and I think you most recently have seen it with the mainstream churches, who are now essentially in the state that I think he's predicting will happen to the evangelical church. What's really happened in the case of the mainstream churches, when you think about it, you go back to, let's say, the first half of the 20th century, when the mainstream churches were really dominant, and then in the 60s and 70s, they hit a peak there, and then after that they started to weaken and dissolve greatly, which is what he's seeing here. It's basically they seem to get strongest right before they collapse. Because what happens, you see, is that the mainstream churches had tied themselves to the age. They had very much fit in with what was going on in the modern world in the first half of the 20th century. In fact, if you go back even further, a lot of what was prior to that, the Reformed churches of the 19th century, a lot of the Calvinist churches of the 19th century that were very dominant then, had tied themselves to that era. Back in the 19th century, the whole idea was, the manifest destiny and progress, etc. And so you get the whole idea, let's say in eschatology, it was very post-millennial, where things are going to get better and better and better to fit in with the idea of progress, you see. And you get this whole sort of merging of culture and church, and the church merely was reflecting the ideas in the culture rather than standing apart from it, rather than saying, more or less looking at things through, they could not separate the city of God and city of man, as Augustine would say. In the 20th century, of course, you had this whole idea, the whole more liberal tendencies, and what you ended up with then was very much the social gospel, which was pretty much the mainstream of Christianity in the first half of the 20th century. They had sort of survived the Scopes trial and kind of got along with Darwin and moved on, and pretty much they went with the social gospel rather than the gospel that saves, but it fit in with the culture of the time that this is what we should be doing, and they were very successful. Mainstream churches were booming in the 50s, 40s, 50s, into the 60s, and then when they seemed to get their largest, they just quickly collapsed because that whole mood, and of course what happens is as time goes on, they would get more and more liberal or more and more towards the social gospel as things would accelerate, and at some point the culture suddenly went the other direction, and these mainstream churches that had more or less been wedded to their age became a widow in the next, as happened with a lot of the Calvinist churches that had wedded themselves to this whole idea of progress. Once, the disasters hit of World War I, of the influenza epidemic, and all these things that happened in the early 20th century, things didn't look so optimistic anymore, and things went in an entirely different direction. And what I think happened with the mainstream churches is exactly what happened there. And of course, what happened was the whole Reagan Revolution, and suddenly you had the mood of the country switched almost overnight. And churches that fit in with that whole idea, that what you happen with these evangelical churches is they had allied themselves with that movement, and they fit very much in with it. I mean, evangelicals were always in the White House during Republican administrations. They were a power base, and they again had wedded themselves to that age. And I think what's happening now is you're getting another mood shift in the American public. They're moving in, and I'm not sure what direction they're going to end up going yet. So I don't think it's that hard to. I don't think it's that easy to determine, but I think this is what's really going on here. And I think this also points out something, that what I would call the historic Christian faith, which you see in the historic churches, that if you cling to that, you're not going to have these swings, okay? And look, throughout history, those churches that cling to their roots, the roots of the church, to the teaching of the church through the centuries, you're never going to be the most popular church. You just never will. It's not going to happen. If you cling to that, you will not be as successful as the mainstream churches were in the 50s and 60s. You will not be as successful as the evangelical churches have been in the 80s and 90s. But once things change, you'll actually be more, they'll completely collapse, as the mainstream churches have done, the evangelicals have done. They'll be on the floor and gasping for air, while those who stick to the historic Christian faith will more or less be in the middle. They will not be the most popular, but they'll never fall on the ground either. And I think there's a lesson there. Again, it's the mainstream churches and the evangelicals wed themselves to their age and had great success during that age, and the minute things changed, it collapsed. The historic churches, those who cling to the historic Christian faith, they may not ever be as successful as, they may never be a mega church, but they make it through. Somehow they make it through. And I think there's a lesson to be learned there. Well, definitely read the articles. I think they're excellent articles, and I just wanted to add my point on that. So thank you very much for your time.